All right, good afternoon again, everybody. This is Paul Ian Cabasag. I'm a structure fire protection engineer working for Simpson Gupperts and Hager. Now let's talk about my lab presentation. And just to remind you, I did the presentation on Camp Wildfire, and in that presentation, I didn't really talk about wildfire test standards as well as the fire safe landscaping standards. So in this presentation, we'll talk about whether materials are fire resistant or not. So first of all, ignition resistant materials. What you see here are on the left is the standards. In order to reduce building loss from wildfires, CAL FIRE had indicated that buildings in the WUI are built with exterior wildfire exposure protection by using construction methods that lessen the ignition risks from burning embers. And on the right here, I'm going to show you subsequently how they had done that. They've approved this manual that shows some approved materials. So what this means for us is essentially the structures should be built with ignition resistant materials. They must comply to CBC 7A and SFM 127A. And what does that mean though? CBC 702A helps us define what an ignition resistant material is, and that's a type of building material that resists ignition or sustained flaming combustion sufficiently so as to reduce losses from the WUI fires under worst case weather, fuel conditions with wildfire exposure of burning embers and small flames. And by developing these standards, these building codes and test standards have formalized a method to reduce the risk of burning embers igniting buildings. So just to give you guys what these standards are, in 701A.1 states that 7A applies to building materials, systems, and assemblies used in exterior design and construction of buildings. 701A.2, it says that CBC 7A establishes the minimum standards in the protection of and increasing the ability of a building in a WUI to resist the intrusion of flames and burning embers projected by vegetation fire or other fires from other structures. And 701A.3, it also indicates that CBC 7A is only applied for new buildings. All buildings that have an approved permit on January 1, 2008, and after that. And also for existing buildings, what does this mean? Well, 7A doesn't apply for the existing materials, it only applies to the new materials. 704A, this says that these standards that constitute SFM 127A are the standards that should be used for testing ignition resistant, non-combustible, and fire retardant treated lumber. And with all of these, so you have 705A, 706A, 707A, 708A, 709A, 710A. These specifically define the types of test standards and types of materials that are ignition resistant. And so just to skip over that, let's talk about SFM 127A1. This is mainly the exterior wall siding sheeting standard. What you see here in the bottom, I've already shown you, is the assembly for the tests. And here below that is just the test procedure. And what this tells us is after you test this exterior wall siding and sheeting with a heat input of 150 kilowatt under a duration of 10-minute burner, then you observe the performance of this assembly for 60 minutes. And if there's no flame intrusion, then that means the exterior wall siding and sheeting are ignition resistant. Okay, moving on to SFM 127A2. This is a standard for exterior windows. As you see here, the assembly shows the how the testing apparatus is built, and on the bottom here shows how the test is conducted. So with this, you have a heat output of 150 kilowatt with a duration of 8-minute burn. And if the window withstands and there's no flame penetration or structure failure after this, then that means it's ignition resistant. Okay, so for SFM 127A3, this is another test standard. Mainly this is for an under eave condition, as you see here, this testing apparatus, and also the testing conducted. So this is very similar. What this tells us is after you heat the eave under a 300 kilowatt burner for 10 minutes, it, if there's no flame intrusion, there's no structure failure, that means that it is ignition resistant. And then for the fourth, SFM 12784, this is the decking standard. What this is another ignition resistant test, the assembly as well as the actual test, where you test this not only from above but also below the deck. And for this case though, you have a heat output of 80 kilowatt for a duration of 3 minutes. And then last, we have for all cases that don't apply, we have a SFM 12785. This is for any ignition resistant material. If you test the material under these conditions of 88 kilowatt for 30 minutes, and if it withstands without any heat penetration as well as any structure failure, that means that the material is ignition resistant. So with all of that, let me just show you how you would find if any material that you guys might add into your structure or your home, or if you're going to build a new construction, how you may actually find if that material is ignition resistant. So one way you can do that is by searching for this manual. It was created by CAL FIRE. It's called the Wildland Urban Interface Product Manual, and I think there's a more current version of this which I couldn't find, but this shows us a few materials that had already passed those 5 testing standards that I've already told you. So this first one right here. So that's for SFM 127A1. You have these materials, sheathing, siding materials, slab siding, and other siding materials. And then for 127A2, we also have some examples of that. So as you see here, there's 2 approved materials for exterior windows. You have one from Millworks as well as Steelworks, and then for there's as well as exterior covering, we also have exterior door assemblies. And the next, we also have materials for under eaves. We have what this shows is some of the approved soffits to close the eave, and we also have some examples of decking materials. One of the ones that we've talked about in class commonly is the Trex product. That can be found right here. And other materials very similar to Trex are TimberTech as well as Sabra International. And then for the ones that don't fit that, we also have other ignition resistant materials, sheathings from Bear Techno Core as well as Chamco, and Hoover treated wood products as well as Timber Seal products. And what really surprised me is there's actually wood roof shake and shingle approved products. We've talked about this numerous times, how maybe you could fire rate wood shake roofs. They're very highly ignitable, and even if you fire rate them, that would mean that that doesn't really necessarily mean that they're good enough for the WUI wildfire scenario, because they're easily weathered away by wind, debris, what have you. So now that's one way of looking for WUI approved products. Another way is if you look at this website here. What this does is it's really easy to use. It's administered by CAL FIRE. It's a search on tool. You just click the prompt box here. You find your designated material, whatever it is. Let's just, for example, look for an exterior window, and you click search, and here you go. Easy as that. And you click on this, click on that, and then this is your approved certification for a WUI material, WUI ignition resistant material. Okay, so let's move on. The next thing on the list is, what about vegetation material? What can you use for a fire safe vegetation used for your landscaping, and well, there's numerous ways. But before we show you that, let's talk about what that means though. So a fire-safe vegetation is one that's not easily ignitable, um, that meets the standard in CFC 49, um, as well as PRC 4291 and PRC 4290. Uh, and there's standards that are used that I'm going to talk about here. So some of them are hazardous vegetation and fuels need to be managed to reduce the severity of potential exterior wildfire exposure to buildings and to reduce the risk of fire spreading to buildings. Buildings and structures within SRA and LRA are required to apply hazardous vegetation fuel management and defensible space provisions. And very similar to ignition-resistant materials, these should be applied for structures that were built where you have an approved permit after January 1, 1991. Existing buildings do not need to apply, but very highly recommended. Defensible space and fuel modification are required by the person by the owner. And in California, the only requirement is to modify your own property and not the community or other neighbors. But there is the notion that if your neighbor's property is intruding in your property, it might be well advised to ask for permission to modify theirs as well. So to reduce the intensity of a wildfire by reducing the volume, the density of flammable vegetation, the strategic siting of fuel modification and green belts need to be provided to increase safety for emergency and fire equipment, as well as evacuating civilians at a point where you are defending against the wildfire. Minimum regulations need to be in place for road standards, for fire equipment access, standards for signs identifying streets, roads, and buildings, and minimum private water supply reserves for emergency fire use, fuel breaks, and green belts. So the required defensible space typically ranges from 30 to 100 feet from your home, depending on the severity zone that you're in and what type of fuel modification requirements are needed. Defensible space mainly for all parcels that are 1 acre and larger, and needs to be a minimum 30-foot setback for buildings and accessory buildings. The defensible space for parcels less than 1 acre need to be consulted with your local fire department, AHJ. Disposal of flammable vegetation and fuel modification need to be completed before completion of road construction and final inspection of a building permit. Green belts, what are these? These are separations between wildland fuels and structures, and they're required to be located within subdivisions and other developments. Mainly to maintain the defensible space of 100 feet from each side of your home and the perimeter of your home. This is not beyond the property line unless it's required by your local fire department or AHJ. The amount of fuel modification necessary shall take into account flammability of the structure, as I've already mentioned. Fuel shall be maintained in a condition so that a wildfire burning under average weather conditions will be unlikely to ignite the structure and other vegetation fuels. The intensity of the fuels managed may vary within a 100-foot perimeter of the structure, the most intense being the first 30 feet, and that's why we implement this 30-foot defensible space zone. Consistent with all fuel management objectives, it is also appropriate to minimize erosion. So it is not the intent to remove all plants. The intent is to strategically select the plants that are needed to be removed so that no continuous horizontal and vertical vegetation fuel are ignited simultaneously. So trees are allowed within a defensible space, provided the horizontal distance between the crowns of adjacent trees and crowns of trees and structures of overhead electrical facilities is not less than 10 feet. We need to maintain this 10 feet so there's no continuity. And besides that, there's also dead wood and litter should be regularly removed from the trees. We need to maintain the roof of a structure free of debris, leaves, needles, and other vegetative materials. Non-fire resistant vegetation or growth should be kept clear of the building or structures in such a manner to provide a clear area for fire suppression operations. Other things to consider are chimneys serving fireplaces. This should have spark arresters. Um, Firewood and combustible material around the home should be protected. There should be a defensible space and clearance between that and other structures. Areas within 10 feet each side of portion of the fire department access roads are required to be cleared of non-fire resistant vegetation growth. And then clearance between brush and vegetative growth from electric transmission and distributing lines needs to be implemented. Okay, so with all of that, now let's talk about where you would find these fire-resistant, fire-safe plants. And so here I've found this website very helpful. We've kind of perused through this website before. It's called the Fire Safe Marin. I know this is only for the Marine County, but in fact, it does give us and offer some suggestions that maybe apply to all of the regions in California. So first of all, fire-prone plants. So these plants are plants that are really easily ignitable. It increases the wildfire intensity, increases the wildfire spread. So what you would like to do is to avoid putting this within the defensible space, and if not, then make sure you have a 100-foot defensible space between this and the structure. So just to serve as an example, a very common type of fire-prone plant is the Coyote Brush. So here, as you can see, very helpful. Tells you don't plant this. It also says it's recommended to avoid this, and the fire resistance is low. And other things to consider is this is very highly combustible. So a lot of helpful information. And another plant that's very fire prone is a eucalyptus tree. Same thing. You shouldn't plant this in your backyard. You need to remove it if it's there, and the fire resistance is poor. As you can see here, very invasive type of plant. All eucalyptus species are prone to fire and should be removed or required significant maintenance within 100-foot of structures to reduce wildfire hazards. And so yeah, you guys can peruse this in your own time. But then now I'm going to move on to fire-resistant plants. I've already defined some of the standards, but how do you choose these? Well, if you look through this website, this icon signifies that they're fire-resistant. So yeah, you have a few selection here, and let's just read some of that. And so this plant, Amber Maple, it says that it is fire-resistant. It also recommends that it's well preferred. Its fire resistant is very good, and it's what it shows here is this plant is easily maintained and it has a low susceptibility to problems. So I guess that's good. And then let's look at another one. So let's see. So there's a lot of selections here. So if you guys are designing your home, before you do that, maybe take a look at these websites and see if they're proper for your defensible space. So here again, so there's a very good fire resistance, and it's preferred. And then let's take a look at one that says it's has more information. Yeah, so there's a lot here. Oh, here we go, lavender cotton. Does this say that it's preferred? It does have very good fire resistance. And one thing that a lot of these say is this plant in particular says it's drought tolerant. And the good thing about that is it doesn't dry up. It probably has a high moisture content. And what does that mean? Well, it means that it's not readily ignitable, and it has a inherent water encapsulated within the foliage or leaves that allow it to have this fire resistance. So all in all, that's what this presentation is all about. We were just here to define the resources involved in finding ignition-resistant materials, as well as fire-safe plants. Thank you so much, and you have a good day. Bye.